Hi, welcome to Prime Talks. And today we have an incredible opportunity to meet a pillar of the mental health community, a pillar of the psychedelic movement community, and to delve deep into a topic that's unfortunately very misunderstood. Before that, I just want to remind everyone that Prime Talks is a project that's entirely philanthropic in nature, in support of pediatric mental health and other mental health initiatives, and where we interview the most interesting, thought-provoking, and innovative leaders on the planet. So we're going to have a fun conversation, and hold on to your seatbelts because there's going to be a lot of pleasant surprises. Sylvia, could I turn it over to you to introduce our
Yes, this is going to be a good one. It is my pleasure to introduce to everybody Dr. Rick Doblin. He is the founder and the president of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which is a 501c3 nonprofit research organization that has been developing medical, legal, and cultural contexts for people to benefit from the careful uses of psychedelics and marijuana. So he has incubated Lycos Therapeutics, which is a drug development company. He has also helped to build the Zendo project, which is a leader in psychedelic harm reduction. He holds his PhD from Harvard, and he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of medical uses of psychedelics. And my favorite is he's also a graduate of New College, which is my alma mater, where he wrote his senior thesis on a 25-year follow-up of the Good Friday Project. The Good Friday Project was a study that looked at mystical experiences, the experiences of God in psychedelics. So with that introduction, Rick, welcome to the show. We're thrilled to have you today.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'm really delighted to be with you. And New College has really influenced us in really positive ways.
Very much so. We went to a school where we didn't have grades, we didn't have course requirements, and where we were encouraged to, shockingly, think for ourselves. But it definitely paid off well for both of us in our lifetimes, I believe. So, I'll go with the first question. Let's start at the beginning. What was the pivotal moment that inspired you to dedicate your life to psychedelic research? I know I've heard you tell the story about your bar mitzvah, and that's part of the origin story.
Yes.
Maybe you can share with us from the bar mitzvah to the moment where you really understood that this was your life purpose. What happened to you? How did you become this person?
Well, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, so I have no older siblings. So when I went for my bar mitzvah, I was really expecting some kind of spiritual transformation, some kind of encounter with the divine, or some kind of inner healing, some kind of real significant change. And, my family was sort of conservative. We went to a conservative temple. Both my grandparents had kept kosher, but my parents themselves, we didn't really keep kosher. But I was really ready when I was 13 for something. And I think there was an immature thing. I was hoping to sort of become a man. That's the whole thing, is you have a bar mitzvah and you become a man. And maybe I was hoping to skip adolescence. But what happened was basically nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the problem. Whenever I woke up the very next morning after my bar mitzvah, I woke up and I'm like, I'm the same. Nothing has really changed. And, I thought God must be busy. This was my idea. A lot of people bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah. And so I figured, okay, maybe tomorrow it'll happen. So I wake up the next day and I'm like, I'm the same. And it happened like that every day. And I kept thinking something's going to happen, something's going to happen. And then a week comes around and a whole new crop of people got bar and bat mitzvah. And I figured if there was a list, I'm now off the list. And whenever I would really reflect on that, and particularly when I wanted to kind of tease my parents, I would say that my bar mitzvah drove me to psychedelics because I was wanting something to happen. And you talk about pediatric mental health. When my wife and I, we have 3 kids, when each of them turned 13, because of my experience with my bar mitzvah, we said to them, we think you're ready for MDMA or marijuana. And if you want to try it, come to us and we'll give you pure substances and we can do it together. And what I didn't anticipate is that was the best anti-drug strategy we could have figured out. Because they were like, we're not ready. Don't give it to us. We'll give it to you later. so that developed in me this hunger that I was wanting something. Where do I fit into the larger world? And, I've since come to learn that rites of passage around ages 12 and 13 are common in cultures all over the world. And that often they do have really transformative potentials. And I think probably for many people in the past thousands of years, bar mitzvahs really did make an enormous big difference, particularly when your lifespan was shorter and that now you're sort of moving into your own. But the first time I took LSD, and it was challenging, and it was when I was 17. So it was 4 years later. And I'll say the reason I grew up, born in 1953, but I grew up a lot during the 1960s. And I believed that if you took LSD 5 or 6 times, you were certifiably insane. That's what we taught. 5
That's
or 6
what people were
times.
told back in the day.
Okay. Not only that, but we were told that it hurt your chromosomes. And just to give you an idea of how strong that belief was, back when now years later, I'm in my early 30s, I'm at the Kennedy School, and there was this woman that I met in class, and she said that she wanted to talk to me about a mushroom experience that she had in college. So I said, okay, come on over for dinner. We'll talk about it. And she said, classically, no, let's go for lunch instead. And then we had this lunch meeting, and we talked about her mushroom trip, and it was really good. And then she said, I just want to let you know, I'd never want to have a real relationship with somebody like you. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? I mean, she said, well, you've taken so much LSD that your chromosomes must be so screwed up. And I was like, you're a smart woman. You're in Harvard, and you're telling me my chromosomes are screwed up from LSD? I said, it may be premature, but let me defend my sperm. And she later became my wife. And we have 3 healthy children, but it just shows that the fear-based information really sticks with people, and even smart people don't know what to believe. So I believed all these negative things about psychedelics. My great grandparents were immigrants into the United States from Russia in 1880, and they came to Chicago. And I was very interested in Russia. I was part of this young group during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we're taught about if the bombs fall, duck and cover, duck under your desk, and it was terrifying. And so I thought, I really need to learn about the other. I was very interested in how Hitler and the Germans would dehumanize and how you end up scapegoating. And so I studied Russian in high school, and in my Russian class in my senior year, I was given a book by a friend of mine. I was too shy to talk to girls. I didn't have any emotions that I could manage. I was all in my head. And this fellow gave me this book to read, and I loved it. And I handed it back to him. And he said, do you realize the person who wrote this book wrote part of it under the influence of LSD? And I'm like, impossible. Nothing good comes from this. That can't be. And he said, no, check it out. And I did. And he was right. It was Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And he did write part of that under LSD. And that made me change everything about my thinking. That maybe.
And Rick, could I ask you just, I think I'd love to dig into where some of these misconceptions come from about psychedelics, but I think just a level set, because it's not that they are without risk. It's not, I don't imagine that that's actually what you're saying. And people who are here, you talk about, offering MDMA or cannabis to your kids at 13. They're like, oh my God, who is this psycho? But I would love to hear, like, what is a realistic baseline that people can work with? And what are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about it? What's like the delta between that baseline and perceived reality?
I think it's good that you're pointing that there are real risks and there are real dangers, and that there's nothing that's all benefits, nothing that's all risks. And LSD in particular is a real challenge psychologically to people. It sort of dissolves your sense of self in certain ways, and you can connect to something larger, but there's a lot of fear in letting go like that. And people will often confuse this sort of what's called ego death or ego dissolution with physical death. So people can actually think they're dying. But with LSD, the actual risks are more psychological than physiological. You can take enormous overdoses of LSD and you're not going to hurt your brain. You're not going to hurt your body. LSD is enormously safe. You take it only in micrograms, millionths of a gram. So the real challenge for LSD is really psychologically. It's this, it's both its
Like psychosis type of psychologically, or
you could. I mean, it can trigger psychosis, particularly when it's taken in recreational settings, not in a therapeutic setting. So when you are experiencing this kind of ego dissolution, if you're supported and you feel safe, that can lead to some of the most important transformative experiences. But if you're not feeling safe and things start happening and you start trying to suppress it, that's when things turn really more difficult.
And I'll just add here for listeners who aren't familiar with how research is done with psychedelics, there's actually something that's called the mystical scale. And they use it in certain studies because what they've determined is that what we call ego death, which you could also call the experience of the mystery or the experience of the divine, it's really one and the same, that the higher or deeper people can go in that regard, the more correlated it is to positive outcomes in many of what the studies are addressing, such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, even things you wouldn't, addiction. And so this idea that the experience of consciousness or that breakthrough ego death can have a positive clinical outcome is what you're talking about. But it's so unfamiliar that it would be like saying, why don't you go get open heart surgery, but you don't have a surgeon in the room?
right.
You want to have support. But I love it that we're starting with talking about LSD, because LSD is kind of in some ways the forgotten stepchild of the psychedelic renaissance, because there's not a lot of IP, or there's not really any kind of, people can't make money from LSD. So you don't see as many studies, but there is a long history of safe use of LSD as a therapeutic tool. And in fact, a creator of AA, creator of that entire program, actually, like the final step for him was an LSD journey and an LSD transformative breakthrough. It's just that part got edited out of the final materials.
Yeah, Bill W. had this profound LSD experience in the 50s, and he really thought that would be a good part of adding into AA, but it became too controversial, and he ended up leaving AA as well.
AA being Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yeah.
To clarify.
It's so useful for addiction.
Yeah, because this idea that for people that are addicted to something, usually they're running away from some kind of trauma or some kind of emotion that they want to cover up in drugs. And the LSD brings these suppressed emotions or fears or anxieties or memories to the surface. And that's where, if you're supported in a safe therapeutic environment and then supported afterwards for the integration, you can learn from it. But if you don't have that support, then you can be disoriented, you can be overly frightened, and you can have psychotic breaks. You know, it's possible to do that. I think I would contrast this with MDMA, which otherwise known as ecstasy, where MDMA doesn't so much dissolve the sense of self, but it strengthens the sense of self. It fills you with self-love, self-acceptance. And so you draw the larger world into you because you're more open to that. And what we've discovered, though, in the work with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, unlike the work with the classic psychedelics, that the mystical experience, which we use the same mystical experience questionnaire that was originated actually for the 1962 Good Friday experiment that I did my 25-year follow-up to, that in MDMA for therapy, there's no correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and reduction in PTSD symptoms. So in our therapeutic approach, we're not really trying to steer people to mystical experience or anything in particular. We just support what's emerging. But with MDMA, people may have heard about with ecstasy, sometimes people have gone to raves or danced all night and overheat, and you can overheat and die from what's called hyperthermia. It's because you're not drinking adequate fluid and you're getting hotter and hotter and hotter and dancing all night. These things never occur in clinical research settings. There's also hypernatremia, where you drink too much water as a way to try to not overheat, and then people can die from that. Also doesn't occur in therapy. So I would say that MDMA is safer psychologically because it reduces the response to fear-based trauma to fear-based memories, and it doesn't dissolve the sense so you're not as scared of you're losing control, but it's more concerned physiologically. So I would say with psilocybin mushrooms, with ayahuasca, the tea from the Amazon, with peyote, that the Native American church, all the classic psychedelics are the ones where they tend to be safer physiologically, but more challenging psychologically.
Right.
The one exception is ibogaine or iboga, which is from the iboga root from Western Africa, which is an incredible experience. One of the most important experiences I've ever had in my life was my iboga experience. But it has this impact on the heart, and it can slow down the heart rate. And some people have died from it. But again, if you take it in a medicalized setting, which is the way it's most responsibly given now, that nobody needs to die, and you should be able to do that. So I think we want to put the classic psychedelics in one category, and then MDMA in a different one. And then ketamine is the one that people may have a lot of familiarity with. Ketamine has been made into a medicine by Johnson & Johnson for depression. And ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. So it's one of the world's essential medicines. It was developed during the 60s. It's incredible for anesthesia. So you get this dissociative anesthetic. It was the main battlefield anesthetic in Vietnam, because you can have a preload syringe and you just stick it in IM in your muscle, and then you're out of pain and out of your sense of self. But 1/10 of that is what's used for treating depression. And so ketamine is safe in this kind of intermittent use, but ketamine is also the most addictive of the psychedelics because it's more of a reliable escape, in a sense, because you're removing yourself in a different way than LSD dissolves the ego. This ketamine kind of moves you more towards anesthesia.
Yeah.
And you're forgetting who you are and forgetting your body. And so it can be used in overused as in kind of a dependent way. And then it has problems with the kidneys. But in general, in a therapeutic sense, it's quite safe. But the way that Johnson & Johnson approved it, and now it's $1 billion sales, it's a blockbuster drug, but they approved it without therapy. And they did the classic pharma trick, which is that looking for things that they could patent. So ketamine itself is now generic. It costs like $1 or $2. But every molecule is like our right hand, like our bodies, our bilateral symmetry. Molecules, when they crystallize, more or less half of them crystallize right-handed, crystallize left-handed. They're the same molecule, but because they're a slightly different shape, they go to different parts in the brain. And so drugs are called racemic when they're the right hand and left hand are together. And that's what MDMA, what all drugs are like that. But what Johnson & Johnson did is they said, we'll take the one part of this, the racemic mixture, which we can then patent as ketamine, which we can patent is not as good as the racemic, and then they can charge hundreds of dollars for it.
Right.
And deliver it without therapy. So I think for people to think about the risks, there's two different kinds of ways to think about it. Is one, when it's under supervision by people know what they're doing, and then the other are the risks when people take it on their own.
Got it.
In kind of recreational settings. And those are really two different. And we train our therapists where they have the option to take MDMA as a patient themselves in FDA-approved protocols. And we've had some of these therapists say that I took MDMA in a party setting, and when I take it in a therapeutic setting, it feels like a completely different drug.
Completely different drug, yeah. I've heard that many times myself. But thank you for the kind of great overview of the psychedelic universe. What made you in particular choose MDMA as sort of a focus of your life work? And maybe you can share with our audience one of the more transformative healings that you've seen as a result of someone working with MDMA.
Okay. Well, first I'll say that one of the stories, I have loads of Israeli relatives, and my great-great-grandmother moved to Palestine in 1904 in order to be buried on the Mount of Olives, which is where the Messiah comes, and they're supposed to come out of a gate of Jerusalem, and there's the Mount of Olives, and that's where they get resurrected first. So I was raised on stories of the Holocaust. And my grandfather came over from Poland in 1920, and the relatives left behind got killed. So I was raised in an incredibly loving, supportive family. And I think that support support helped me to realize that I could wrestle with these more frightening parts of the world without being overwhelmed. And so I was really secondarily traumatized, you could say, by stories of the Holocaust. And that was just like, how do you deal with that? My family was well off, and I realized that, you could have all the money in the world and you could still end up in a concentration camp. And then later, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened when I was, around 10 years old. And so that was my second kind of really major trauma of thinking the whole world could blow up, and duck and cover is what we're taught. And then the third one for me was Vietnam. So I was in one of the last years of the lottery. So now the evil was Hitler. Then it was, now it's the Russians. Now it's everybody. It's my own country in a way doing stuff. And so I just started understanding. There's a quote by E.O. Wilson that's tremendous, a professor at Harvard. And what he said is the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. And so I started realizing, and this was also happening at the time, awareness was happening at the time we were sending people to the moon. And the astronauts would come back, some of them, and say, I saw the Earth as one thing, and we're all together, and I don't see the religions, and I don't see the countries. And my father and mother had this idea. My father, his parents were really poor. They came in, they had a bookstore in the Bronx. He learned how to read a book without breaking the spine so they could sell it again after he read it. And he knew by the time he was 4 years old that he had to be a doctor. That was the classic Jewish, how do you get out of poverty? And he enjoyed being a doctor, but he decided to raise us to help us do what we wanted to do. He was sort of programmed at an early age. So I'm starting to think the world's a mess. There's so much potential destructive capabilities. I'm out of balance. I'm overdeveloped intellectually, underdeveloped emotionally and spiritually. The world is like that. We have technologies that we don't know how to handle. And then when it came time for Vietnam, I decided I'd studied Thoreau and Gandhi and Tolstoy, all these theorists about nonviolence and nonviolent resistance, kind of like the Quaker approach. And so I decided that I would be a draft resistor. Instead of going to Vietnam, I would not register for the draft. I had a passport, a driver's license, Social Security number, was paying taxes in high school. So I assumed I would be caught and put in jail. And that was fine. That was what I was going to do. And my parents were like, well, if that happens, we support what you're doing, but you'll never be able to be a doctor or lawyer or anything like that because you'll have a felony record. So, okay, that's a price I need to pay. So I was sort of thinking, what am I going to do with this crazy world? How do I try to make it better? I had this gift from my family to say that we'll make sure you don't starve and we'll make sure you have a place to live. And so I didn't know what to do. And after I read this Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I decided to try LSD. And so the first time I tried LSD, I felt this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Who am I? Where do I fit in? I need courage. I'm scared to let go. And I feel, now I have these emotions and I'm feeling. And so I was so confused but it was something that tapped into something deeper. And so I went to the guidance counselor at New College. This was, again, 1972. And I said, help me with my tripping. And the guy, he took me seriously and he gave me this other book to read. And it was by Stanislav Grof, sort of the world's leading LSD researcher. He was at Johns Hopkins at the time. And it was about realms of the human unconscious, observations from LSD research. And it talked about all the different states of mind that people show under LSD. And one of them is this mystical experience, this sense of being connected to everything. And I thought, aha, this has political implications. If you feel part of everything and everything is part of you, then the other is not really the other in the same way. So this idea of dehumanizing others and killing others and making scapegoats, I thought this psychedelic experience, if more people have it, it could contribute to making it a better world. And this was after the backlash of the 1970 Controlled Substances Act and research was shut down. And so I decided that I would be an underground psychedelic therapist. Because you don't need a license to do that. So at 18 years old, I identified that I am a counterculture drug-using criminal. That's who I decided I was. And I would say
it's all upside from there.
Yeah. And so the arc of my life has to become from counterculture to culture, from criminal to legal. And I've found psychedelics have been valuable throughout the lifespan. But I wasn't mature enough to do it. I really had these difficult experiences. And I took 10 years out to get grounded. I built houses. I worked in the physical world. And when I was now 28 years old and ready to go back to college, by the way, I should add that when I was 18, this is just to show you how fantastic my parents were. I said, and I'm the oldest of 4 kids, the first one off to college, and I'm flaming out and burning up with my psychedelic experience. So I said, I want to drop out of college. I want to study LSD, and I want you guys to pay for it. And after a couple of months, they said yes.
Wow.
It was incredible. My parents said, it's a mistake. We think you're making a terrible mistake, but we're going to help you, because if we don't help you, it's going to take you longer to realize it's a mistake. And then when you realize it, you're not going to want to admit it, because then your parents will have been right. So we will help you. And then they said, maybe there's a tiny shred of truth that you know what you need to do. So that was amazing. Okay, so then I drop out of college for 10 years. I'm finally ready to go back to school, and New College permits you to do off-campus study. So my very first semester back, I went to Esalen in Big Sur, and there was a month-long workshop with Stan and Christina Groff called The Mystical Quest, and they had developed how to alter your consciousness without drugs through hyperventilation. This idea, they call it holotropic breathwork. So I was learning about that. I was learning to become a psychedelic therapist. I was developing a curriculum to teach me to go through New College again. And this woman, Debbie Harlow, came by and said, hey, there's a new drug, and it's called Adam. And it's a drug that makes you feel love and makes you feel connected and helps you be a better listener. And it's got all these properties. And I like, well, okay, so what? You know, I'm in love and I'm the good listener and I feel pretty able to communicate. And I saw a group of people in a circle doing MDMA talking to each other. And I was so dismissive. I was like, well, if you can talk, you know, you take ayahuasca or you take a bunch of mushrooms or you take LSD, there's a period of time where you can't even talk, where it's nonverbal. So I like to say that I was stupid enough to underestimate it, but smart enough to buy some. And I took some home and I did it with my girlfriend, and it was so profound. It was just so deep and so opened us up. That I just felt like this is a gentler version of LSD. And when I learned about it as codename Adam for MDMA, I was told that it was also starting to be used as a party drug under the name ecstasy. So I thought, I learned about LSD after the backlash, 1972. And partially because I had certain privileges, I thought, oh, this will be the fight I want for my life. Then I said, I learned about MDMA before the backlash. And I thought, now this is a time for me to get involved. And that's where I started really saying, and I saw that this is the work I want to do with MDMA. And I saw that MDMA is more gentle than the classic psychedelics. It's extremely profound. And so I felt that this would be the way to sort of bring psychedelics back, would be to start with MDMA. And the other part of it was what we needed. And I've always said that we do science. We don't actually do science. We do political science. The science is chosen for political reasons. So one of the key things that was necessary to take something that's so suppressed, that is just so stigmatized, is we needed sympathetic patients. And in 1984, I had shared MDMA with a friend of mine, and he did MDMA with a girlfriend of his who I didn't know. And during that experience, and this gets, Mo, to your question about risk. So during this experience, she had earlier in her life been raped and almost killed. And she'd been in and out of mental institutions. She'd been on medications. She kind of had adopted a better balance. But the MDMA brought the trauma to the surface in a way that she wasn't able to fully deal with it. The friend of mine was not a therapist. And so she got so in touch with the pain that she checked herself into a hospital not to kill herself. And they
Wow.
stabilized her, but they gave her the same old drugs that she knew she'd had before that didn't work. And she was more suicidal when she got out than when she went in. And so my friend called me and said, would you be open to helping her? And I'm like, look, I'm not qualified. I just came back from another month-long workshop at Esalen on spiritual emergence, also with Stan and Christina, training people to deal with people that are breaking down, to see that maybe that's something about finding a higher order. Maybe the breakdown can be healthy. And so I talked to her on the phone and I said, if you agree to not kill yourself when we work together, I'll work with you. And that,
Sounds like a good deal.
Yeah,
yeah,
that was like really revolutionary work that the Grofts were doing at the time. That they even
Right.
had a new frame where they would say somebody who's having a breakdown, a mental breakdown, is going through a dark night of the soul for spiritual transformation, not they're mentally ill and they need to be medicated to fix it. It was a revolutionary frame at the time.
yeah. And it wasn't spiritual emergency, it was spiritual emergence in a way. So I saw right then, and it helped her. And she now has become one of,
Rick, can we actually just double click on that? Like, when this is effective, right? And what is actually happening in the brain during a
okay,
psychedelic experience that makes it so effective in helping people process trauma or deal with emotional pain that they cannot otherwise deal with?
yeah.
Why is that the case?
Okay, so when you have PTSD, I'll say that then PTSD brought us sympathetic patients, either veterans or women who've been sexually abused. When you have PTSD, it changes your brain. You have the amygdala, the portion of our brain that responds to fear. You have more activity. Your amygdala is hypersensitive. Your prefrontal cortex, where you think logically, there's less activity. So that you hear a sound and you immediately think it's an explosion or something, that you don't have enough time to sort of sort it out. And the hippocampus, where we put memories into long-term storage, has diminished activity. So that's how PTSD changes your brain. MDMA does almost the exact opposite. MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala so that your fear response is damped down. So you can recall the trauma in a way that is not overwhelmingly fearful. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, so you have a little bit more logical ability to think about things. So, somebody raped me in a red hat. Every time I see a red hat, I feel terrible. But now you can say, well, that was from that situation, doesn't overgeneralize to everybody. But MDMA also increases activity in the hippocampus and the connection with the amygdala, so you can take memories. With PTSD, the memories are never really processed and put into the past. They're always like about to happen or happening, because the feeling is that it's overwhelming and you dissolve and it's too scary. So the MDMA helps you to experience, helps you redo your cognitive thinking about things, and helps you put it into long-term storage. So traumas become part of your story, but they come background instead of foreground. And then you're able to move forward. And the other big part of it is oxytocin. So MDMA releases the hormones, oxytocin being the primary one, which is the hormones of love, connection, nursing mothers, that this oxytocin gives you this feeling of self-love and self-acceptance, and it builds connection and trust with those people that you're around. And you feel so comfortable in yourself in a way that then you can have these powerful emotions, which you still have this kind of peaceful observer while you're having it. And then it puts into long-term memory storage. And then if you do the integration work, so I want to make this clear that it's not just about this drug experience, it's really about the therapy that happens afterwards,
Right.
for weeks or months afterwards, to anchor what happened into long-term change. So I think that MDMA gives you this opportunity in a safe, supportive setting to really change how your brain processes certain memories, and it changes that. So there's this whole concept of what's called neuroplasticity, or critical periods. So we all know that when you're young, it's easier to learn languages than when you're old.
Yeah.
There's all these critical periods, and this social bonding is also kind of a critical period when you're young. And this MDMA opens this up so that you can rewire your brain in ways that you may have been stuck with for decades. We've had Vietnam vets who had PTSD for almost half a century, going round and round in these same circles, and they're still able to heal. And it's something that's been sometimes very difficult versus impossible for them to do with talk therapy. And the SSRIs, the medicines that are given by pharmaceutical companies to deal with PTSD, they control the symptoms, but they don't get to the root cause. And then you need them every day. And then you have all these side effects. So our approach, and this is in a way why we started in this nonprofit context, is that we want to make people not need the drug every day or even very often. We want to make it so that people make fundamental change, get to the root cause, then with the non-drug integration, anchor the experience so that then they don't need medications or don't need drugs.
Wait, you mean you're developing a drug that you don't want people to have to take forever and ever and ever?
Sometimes, okay, so then you asked me about an unusual experience. So I'll tell you this is not common. But our therapy is 42 hours of therapy with 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart. Okay, so this was a situation where there was someone who was a veteran, and he'd been disabled for about a decade because a lot of his friends were killed in Iraq, and it just became overwhelming for him. And he was unable to function, and he volunteered to be in our study. So on his first MDMA experience, he's into it just a little bit more than an hour. It takes about an hour once you take it to sort of be full. And he started realizing, because, again, the fear is reduced, his cognitive is enhanced, that there was something positive about him being disabled with PTSD. And the positive thing was that's how he showed loyalty to the friends of his who had died. He was honoring the memory of the friends who had died, and he was thinking about them all the time, and that he became just overwhelmed with these fears. And so once he realized that this was a way to honor the friends of his that had died, somehow or other he switched, and he saw himself through the eyes of his dead friends. In a way, you could say your imagination is more active. So he's looking at himself from the eyes of his dead friends. And what they're saying is, we cannot live. We are dead. We don't want you to honor us by squandering your life, by just suffering. We'd like to live through you. So go ahead and live, and you can honor us by having a great life. Wow. And then he said, okay, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? And he said in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD.
Wow.
But then he said, I'm taking opiates for pain. And I don't really think I need them for pain. I think I'm more taking them for excuse, for escape. He said, I don't need the opiates anymore. I'm going to stop the opiates. And then he said, I'm done. I don't need the MDMA anymore either. You've got 2 more MDMA sessions. I don't need them. I'm done. Wow. And the therapist said, this is an experiment. Would you at least do the follow-up at 2 months and 1 year? And he said, sure. 2 months, no PTSD. 1 year, no PTSD. Over 15 years ago that took place. I'm still in touch with him. And he was this insight, this emotional release that leads to this insight that led to this conversation with his dead friends. And he didn't go back to the opiates. He didn't go back to the MDMA. It's just astonishing.
It's a beautiful story. It's a really beautiful story. Rick, I want to actually dial into this a little bit, because one of the things that we're most passionate about and trying to help address is obviously the mental health crisis. And of course, there's the pharma lobby that's doing its thing. There's the regulatory constraints that are doing their thing. And then there are people who are just hesitant, right? Because it's new, it's foreign. It has all these taboos and connotations. What advice would you give, to people who are struggling with mental health and are a little reluctant? What advice would you give to the practitioner community? What advice would you give to others that just want to minimize the pain that we're seeing through all the mental health challenges that we've been talking about?
Well, the advice that I would first off say to people is that there is hope. I think that's the most important piece. People often kill themselves because they've lost hope. And so there is hope. Now, these drugs are not yet FDA approved. We're moving in that direction. I think in the next couple of years, MDMA will be approved, psilocybin will be approved. So the first message is there are tools here that in the proper context can be helpful to you. Secondly, I would say to practitioners that it's not about the drug. When you get the SSRIs or you get surgery or you get any kind of medications, that usually those are the therapy. But this really, it's not about the drug, it's about the therapy, the human relationship. So I would say to practitioners that there's a certain training that's required. And I think that if you are willing to go through this training to be more helpful to your patients, that there will be opportunities to put this into practice in legal above ground context. And I will also say that psychedelics have been used for thousands of years. It seems like, we're bringing this new and it's a psychedelic renaissance, but people have been using psychedelics for thousands of years. And they've been using them for this mixture of healing and spirituality. And they've been using them in community. And so I think one of the problems that I would say that happened from the 60s is there was no elder support. It was like this young generation was coming on these psychedelics. Nobody knew how to advise them. And you had this idea, one dose, miracle cure, now I'm enlightened. And so I would say to people that we need to get rid of this idea of a one dose miracle cure. That the story I just told you was a one dose miracle cure.
Right.
But that's extremely rare. And so it's about hard work and it's about this integration process. So I would also say to people, look at the science, because really what we're trying to do is ground the research through drug development science, through academic science, and that a lot of the things that people have been taught about psychedelics are exaggerated fears, but there are genuine fears and there are genuine risks, as we started talking about. So don't think that I'm saying that this works for everybody or that there are no risks. But I think for people who have problems, there's hope. For practitioners, if you go through the training, these tools can be available. And the science is demonstrating this over and over and over. And yet, how is it that thousands of years people have used this? Because we're physical creatures. And when we think about a big part of our brain is how do we keep this body alive? From birth to death. So some people may know about Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. So it's your survival needs and belonging needs and self-esteem needs. It goes to, many people have been taught that self-actualization is the peak of this pyramid of self-actualization. You become your full self. But in the last few years of his life, Maslow met Stan Grof, started learning a lot about psychedelics, and he changed it. And this is where I think philanthropy, in a way, you could come in to say, in a sense, that the top was no longer you become your full self. He said the top was self-transcendence. You go beyond your sense of self and you realize, like, I'm only able to do what I did because of my family. It's not that I accomplished this all on my own.
Right.
So people realize that you're not just yourself. And you're not just supported by humans, you're supported by animals, you're supported by nature, you're supported by the whole ecosystem on Earth. And then you start talking about giving back. And I think that's really this kind of evolution of spirit. And there's this Jewish story about this old man and this young boy, and the old man's planting an apple tree. And the little kid is saying, why are you doing this? Because you're not going to live long enough to get any fruits from this tree.
Right.
Like, well, I'm doing it for you. And there were trees here when I came here. So you think in these multiple generations and you think about making it better for everybody. And I'll just add that one of our big projects at MAPS is we do a lot of work in Israel. Israel's so many traumatized people, and some of the experts in PTSD research are in Israel. But I'm also trying to do work with Palestinians. We've got now a project in East Jerusalem, a hospital in East Jerusalem that wants to do MDMA with Palestinians. And I've been invited to Beirut. I'm going to Beirut in May to try to talk, which for me is kind of amazing because my Israeli relatives were just in Lebanon carrying guns as part of the IDF.
Wow.
And I'm being invited to come tell stories about MDMA. I'm going to Ukraine at the end of April to train Ukrainian therapists.
Oh.
And I think that this idea of giving back, of the self-transcendence, and so when I realized that MDMA, 1982, I said, okay, I've had this experience. There will be a backlash. This is what I was going to focus on. Now it's 43 years later, and we're close to getting FDA approval. And one of the most important projects is taking place in Toronto. And I'll just mention this, is that MDMA is a tool, and it can be used in many different kind of therapeutic approaches. We've developed this one called inner-directed therapy. So this is kind of, you support what's emerging.
Yeah.
And you believe that people have this wisdom that we don't consciously have, and they don't even consciously have. You know, what we say is you prepare for your psychedelic experience, and you do all the issues you want to work on, and you do all this preparation, and then right before the psychedelic experience, you just rip it up and throw it out. And then whatever comes is what you deal with, and it can be in many different ways. So we did a first project with what's called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And what that is, it's developed by Candace Monson, who was at Ryerson University, Ann Wagner, who's at Remedy Institute in Toronto. And they worked at the VA, and it took 2014. I'd been talking since 1990, roughly, with the VA, saying, hey, you should do MDMA for PTSD. It took till 2014 when we had Richard Rockefeller, who was my main thought partner for 6 years, and then his cousin, Senator Jay Rockefeller, was on the Senate Benefit Affairs Committee, and they said, work with these two people from Toronto with blending MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, because conjoint means couples. You focus on the person with PTSD and their partner, and they both get MDMA. And so you're working both with the, quote, designated patient, but people lose track that it affects their families, and they often don't get the attention. So this therapy is trying to bring the partner into the therapy. Both got MDMA, and the results were better than anything they'd ever done without the MDMA, both in reduction of PTSD and in strength of the relationship. And so Ann Wagner is now doing that in a larger scale in Toronto right now.
It's amazing. That's amazing. I want to just jump off something you said earlier, because look, you were talking about a lot of philanthropic objectives. We also should maybe spend a little time talking about the investment side.
Yeah.
Because again, the audience here is very influential families and advisors. So how would you see the intersection of psychedelics and business, investment, philanthropy? How do those come together for you?
Well,
You can tell us what you really think.
what I really think is that what I wanted to achieve was nonprofit donations, that then we would create this public benefit pharmaceutical company that would be 100% owned by the nonprofit. And then it would make money for a certain period of time using what's called data exclusivity. You don't need patents. And that would be, so I wouldn't have to keep going to donors all the time for donor exhaustion. I could say we could build this engine of healing that can also throw off money, and then we can use it for further research. What happened in 2018 and 19 is, since 1986, and finally by 2018, 2019, we were able to start phase 3 studies, and we demonstrated that there is a way through the FDA. And that led to the rise of for-profit psychedelic companies. And now there's hundreds of these for-profit psychedelic companies. That made it, for me at the moment, impossible to raise more money from donors. So we had to take investors. Now, once we started taking in investors in this public benefit pharmaceutical company, incentives changed. And I think the concern that I had and what actually happened is I thought that what we're doing is we're building an ecosystem, even though strategic reasons so that we could get bipartisan support with MDMA for PTSD. Right now, there's very few things in America that are outside of the culture wars. But psychedelics are one of the few things that are outside of the culture wars because we had chosen this particular patient population. So because we were able
Because you're
to...
working with vets, you're saying.
Yeah, yes.
So
Because we're working...
so everyone wants to support a vet. It's bipartisan.
Yeah, and the sort of somewhat sad part about that is most of the PTSD patients are women who've had sexual abuse.
Yeah.
of different kinds or
I'm
childhood.
aware of
But
that.
the media focuses on, the veterans. Right. So once we took, so our goal is build the ecosystem. I don't think that ketamine is competition. I don't think psilocybin is competition. I don't think 5-MeO-DMT. We're trying to build the entire ecosystem. However, once we started getting investors, then they started thinking all these other people doing these other things are competitors, not collaborators in building the. Okay. And then they said FDA has never done any kind of psychedelic-assisted therapy. That's never been done before. So a lot of the for-profit companies right now are thinking, let's try to minimize the therapy. Let's be like a drug company. Johnson & Johnson, billion-dollar sales from ketamine, blockbuster drug without therapy. The problem is that when you use ketamine without therapy, the results fade. And what happens? You need more ketamine. So when you do it with therapy, the results are more durable. But where does the money go? It goes now more to the therapist, and you don't sell as much ketamine. So I would just say there's lots of opportunities for investors, but ideally these would be impact investors that are willing to make some sort of balance between return to shareholders and public benefit. And what I've seen is with our own particular company, it moved more in the direction of return to shareholders and less about we're building an ecosystem and more traditional approaches. And that led, I think, to the FDA rejection because now the FDA rejected us in August of last year. The pharma company did traditional things. So I think if investors are thinking to invest in this space, to realize this is innovation. This is something that's never been done before, and you need new approaches. You can't just use a traditional approach to move this forward.
So an example of that would be, typically you would have to double blind a study. It's very difficult to double blind an MDMA experience. Like you kind of know if you're on it or not.
Or with LSD or ketamine, anything like that. So that was one of the big criticisms. So we had made an agreement.
Could you just clarify that? Why is it difficult to double blind?
Because if on 2 different days, one day I give you a pill, it's either MDMA or a placebo, and then the next day it'll be the crossover, you will almost certainly be able to tell when it was nothing and when it was MDMA. It's not like you're taking a vaccine where you don't know what's in it, you have an immediate response that's very strong. And so it's difficult to do a double-blind study. My dissertation at the Kennedy School, which I was focused on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana, I thought I'd solved the problem that you do therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. And everybody knows they're getting MDMA. Everybody is thinking the same way, the same expectations. And I thought the challenge is to find a dose of MDMA that is high enough to cause some confusion with a full dose, but not so high that you get all this therapy benefits, so you can't tell the difference between the two groups. So we did therapy with inactive placebo, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. This whole kind of dose response. And what we discovered is that my dissertation, luckily I discovered I was wrong after I got my PhD, but what we discovered is that the low doses would give some confusion. They would increase the blinding, but they made people uncomfortable. It's like you're taking off an airplane and there's turbulence at the beginning, but you're not. So you're activated without enough fear reduction.
Right.
And so the people that got therapy with no MDMA did better than the people that got therapy with low-dose MDMA. And then we discovered, to my surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group was remarkably effective, more so even than we anticipated. We did a study with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And this will just give you an idea, again, of what we mean by political science. I didn't have any idea that we would get a police officer, but I wanted it in the title. Veterans, firefighters, and police officers. So we're sending a signal to the criminal justice community, the people that are arresting people for MDMA all the time, that this is also for them. And one group got 30 milligram, one got 75, and one got 125. And we did get a few police officers, actually, in the end. But the 75 milligram dose group did better than the 125. And it was a small study. When you randomized, the people at 125 had more depression with the PTSD than the people that got 75. But nevertheless, the 75 did great. So there was no sweet spot between here's a dose that causes confusion, but it doesn't diminish the effect, or now you get a little bit higher. So we negotiated with the FDA and we said, we'll give you blinding, but you're making our job easier. Because the real question is, can you do this with therapy? Why do you even bother to add the drug? So FDA chose therapy with inactive placebo, but then the people we negotiated with in 2017 left the FDA and new people came in that were more conservative. And that's what caused some problems. They raised this whole thing. Oh, your blinding doesn't work. Oh, well, of course the blinding doesn't work. We told you, we give you blinding, but.
And so that's interesting. That certainly explains why these double-blind studies are challenging in this context. And Rick, I know I'm kind of mindful of the time, but there's a couple of topics I'd love to touch on with you, because we've talked about the mental health benefits and all the research that supports it. Could we talk a little bit about the role that psychedelics have as a tool for expanding consciousness, awareness, leadership, connectivity? How are you thinking about that? What is a healthy construct through which others could consider the engaging in this world for those purposes?
Well, there are a lot of CEOs and business people that are now experimenting with psychedelics. And sort of the classic example we have of all these tech people that are microdosing psychedelics for creativity. There was a study with psilocybin that was really interesting. It was called semantic priming. So what that means is I say day, you say night. I say sun, you say moon. You say a word and you sort of want to see how people respond. So you prime them with a word and you see what they respond. And they respond normally in the patterns that are most common. Under psilocybin, people have a wider range of responses. So your brain isn't stuck to these patterns. You have a more fluid, expansive set of associations, and some of them can be good ideas, or some of them can be creative insights. So that I think there's a whole potential use in the future as we move forward for businesses, for people to get together for creative problem solving. We have something at MAPS that we call smokable tasks. So this is part of our employee manual. So what is a smokable task? A smokable task is something that where you use drugs at work and you and your manager think you're at least as good or better when you're high than when you're not. And so one of the main smokable tasks is problem solving, creative thinking, brainstorming. Because again, you come up with a wider range of things. Now, it doesn't mean every idea you have is good. It just means you need to think about them after you're no longer high. But it's great for idea generation, and sometimes the insights are really incredible. Another project that we've been working on is a small group of Israelis and Palestinians are doing ayahuasca and MDMA together. Together.
In the same session?
Well, what I meant is Israelis and Palestinians together. They'll do ayahuasca one time and MDMA another time.
Okay.
So
guys they're blending that together. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. So it's for psychedelics to promote transformation of conflict in certain ways. We're trying to do what Ann Wagner is going to be doing here in Toronto is MDMA for couples therapy. She's going to move to where not everybody needs to have PTSD, one of the couple, just MDMA for couples therapy. So I think that there's going to be a lot of applications for creative thinking. There was research that was done in the 60s with mescaline, which is the main active ingredient in peyote, and also LSD. And it would bring engineers and others who had sort of business problems. They were trying to invent this or that, and they were blocked. And they would bring them into the lab and they would give them either mescaline or LSD, and they would work on these problems. And a lot of times they would find solutions for it. So I think this idea that on the one hand, we work with treating mental illnesses and mental conditions. And I think that's how we start. That's how you change culture. That's how you generate information that's more accurate about risks and benefits. But this other whole part about creative thinking and insights, there's this. Now, okay, I just heard this story. I was just in Iceland for a psychedelic conference, and this guy who was at the conference told me that he had a DMT experience, and under DMT, he had this entity type thing that was sort of giving him ideas. And one, he said, the main idea was light without time. And somehow or other, he was not a physicist, but he started learning about physics. And he's made these incredible discoveries based on some of these insights that he said he's spoken to some other people, including some people that got Nobel Prizes. And some of them have said they've also used DMT to get new ideas. But again, it's not just that you get this idea. You have to do the work. You have to verify if it's true. You have to try to understand it.
Could we go back to just the Israeli-Palestinian situation? Like, if I understand correctly, and please feel free to set me straight, MDMA kind of fosters more embracing connectivity, more warmth, more empathy, just a greater sort of globalism for people towards one another. So the question I have is, if somebody is bona fide and committed to terror, murder, whatever else, dousing them with MDMA, sitting them down for a whole bunch of sessions, is there any research, data, anything? What is the outcome? Could that be a solution, or is that just too far out? Like, where does this begin and end?
Well, okay, one of the things that happened to me was that I was contacted by a U.S. Army interrogator after he had left the Army, after he realized they were using torture in Guantanamo. And he wanted nothing to do with it. And he left, and he was gone for a couple of years. And then he contacted me, and he said, what do you think about MDMA? Could you give MDMA to people? And would that be a more humane way than torture to try to understand where they were? And so, first off, I was shocked because we'd been doing the CIA did a lot of the work with mind control in the 50s and 60s with psychedelics.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was scandalous and terrible. And so we had built up psychedelics about healing, about understanding the brain. And this was now this return of the sort of the darkness of the CIA. But this guy had left it, and I wasn't even sure if I wanted to talk to him, but I did talk to him. And it turned out he was a wonderful guy. And he was the one that was friends with Richard Rockefeller's son. And that's how I got to meet Richard Rockefeller in part. But what I believe is that if you're a true believer of whatever it happens to be, and you take MDMA, you may reinforce your views. But let's say you're someone who's been coerced into doing terrorism or something. You don't really want to do it. I think under MDMA, your underlying sense that you didn't really want to do it would come out. One of the things that we're talking about, and this is not exactly what you're saying, but one day to work with people who have recently got out of prison to try to help them work through their traumas so that they don't go back to prison.
How about in prison?
Well, in prison, it's harder to get permission to do.
I'm sure that's a very lofty goal, but one, to be able to heal all of the things that happened to you in the past that are the reason why you ended up where you are. From what I understand, MDMA in many ways is like a truth serum.
Yes.
And I think that's something we haven't completely touched on, is that there's a way that somebody, when they're experiencing MDMA, they speak the truth, not just to other people, but mostly to their own self.
Yes.
And that is so powerful to hear. To hear you speaking your own truth to yourself is one of the most healing forces on the planet.
Yeah. And when you talk about people who are into violence, let's say, a lot of them have been traumatized, or almost all of them probably have been traumatized at a different point. And if you can work through your traumas, then you can actually sometimes develop compassion, or you understand that the people that hurt you were also hurt, and you might choose a different way. You've learned a little bit more fluidity with emotions. And so I think that there is enormous potential over time for taking people that are at odds with each other, either just politically or with violence or both, and to help them become clearer about where they're coming from. And then this idea of seeing your common humanity. When you dehumanize others, it's easier to do all sorts of stuff to them. But if you understand your common humanity. Now, I'm not saying that psychedelics are going to solve all these problems. And I will give one example where the culture is more important than the psychedelic experience and how you interpret it, in the same way that the therapeutic setting is more important than the drug. So there is an example of the Unha de Vegetal, which is it's a religious ayahuasca religious church from Brazil. But they're not like from native cultures. Only because of the conquistadors and the Catholic Church, they've had to sort of blend. They're called syncretic religions. And so the União de Vegetal is homophobic, hierarchical, patriarchal, and as many religions, they get attached to power. So some of the people that were part of the União de Vegetal, some of the leadership actually, aligned themselves with Bolsonaro, who was destroying the Amazon. And yet their sacrament came from the Amazon.
Wow.
This is where when we get into consciousness and cultural change, what our long-term goal is, and this is idealistic in a way, but it's mass mental health and a spiritualized humanity where we see how we're all in it together. I'll give one example of this, which was I did MDMA on the top of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Desert, and it was with two Jewish guys, myself and a close friend, and a Christian girl who later has become my wife, and we raised our kids Jewish, but she was Christian, and a Muslim woman that was in a romance. So we're two Jewish guys and two women who are not Jewish, and we just felt this incredible love for each other and for what we were trying to do together. And yet we realized at one point that every single religion was going to be pissed off at what we were doing. Because here it is, I'm a Jewish guy, we're the religion of the mother, and I'm with a non-Jewish one. In Islam, it's the religion of the father. And this woman who's Muslim is now with a Jewish guy, and everybody's marrying out of their faith. And yet we all felt this incredible love together. And so I think that the possibility is with psychedelics that you both see your common humanity and appreciate your differences. In fact, you are glad for the differences because we look at the world in a different way. We're more enriched by people who are different with us, but who we have developed some sort of common ground. So I think it's paradoxical that you both become more your unique self and yet also understand more your commonality. And that's the long-term goal of this spiritualized humanity, that it doesn't mean one world religion and we're all the same. It just means that we all are anchored so deep in ourselves and so comfortable that then we can see people who are different and they're not a threat to us.
Yeah.
I have one other story if we have time. I just want to add this because you talked about pediatric mental health. All right, so this is kind of an unusual story. The FDA has said right now that we can only work with people with PTSD that are 18 years or over. But if they do approve MDMA for PTSD, then we are required and also incentivized to work with adolescents with PTSD and then go down the age. And so the theory is that we want to treat people the closer to the trauma. So one thing we know from ketamine is that when you give ketamine for anesthesia, which is 10 times the psychedelic dose, when you are done with the operations or whatever, are moving through, as the ketamine is diminishing, you move through a psychedelic phase, and they call it the emergent phenomena. And adults have way more problems with the emergent phenomena than kids. Kids are more what's real, what's not, more imagination, they can handle it. So this was now that sort of baseline. So now this is in the 80s, and neighbors of mine were doing MDMA, and they said they wanted to do it with their family. And they had a 7-year-old girl. And they're like, should we do this with this 7-year-old girl? Now, I knew at that time, when you look at the ayahuasca communities, you look at the Native American church, they don't have age limits. I went to a Native American church peyote ceremony on the Navajo reservation, and a Navajo man brought his 9-year-old son to eat peyote with us.
Wow.
Incredible. So so they take lower doses. It's within family settings. Some people are called to be shamans, and they're sometimes called at a younger age. And so they don't have age limits. So this neighbor is saying, we would like to do MDMA, and we would like to include our 7-year-old daughter. And I said, well, I understand from what I know that it's not going to really hurt her. There's no brain damage, but give her a half a dose, something like that, if you're going to do it. So they decided to do it. And I went to visit them the day after. And I went to talk to this girl. And I was like, well, what happened when you did MDMA? She said, well, I thought I was up in heaven watching my mother before she got pregnant with me get ready to be a mother. And I was like, did you really think you were up in heaven? And she said, I don't know. It just felt like that. And I was like, that told me she wasn't just telling it as a story to get attention. That's what it really felt like to her. And so I think when we think about working with children, when they, I focus more on traumatized children, particularly when we think about refugees or people in war-torn areas or things like that, that when you don't treat the trauma, it just gets worse and worse. They get isolated more and more. And so I think one of the future areas of study is going to be
Early
working with
intervention.
traumatized children.
Yeah, that's
Interesting.
incredible.
Wow.
That is incredible. Rick, first of all, this is so amazing.
So we could talk on and on and on. I just want to say to our audience, like there are so many ways to support and become involved in the psychedelic universe. I'll name a couple of my favorites. I just came back from working with the Yanawana, which is a tribe from Brazil. If you feel called to support some of the indigenous traditions and these tribes that have been preserving some of this culture and knowledge for thousands of years, I think it's always great to investigate that. The other is supporting access. I feel like it's a big need right now. The access to these therapies is still limited, and anyone who wants to get behind increasing access is a great cause. And if you want to also get involved, you can donate to MAPS. MAPS is probably the most respected, longest standing nonprofit in the space. And so we'll put a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to get involved and contribute to MAPS.
Yeah, I'll also add two things quickly. One is that we're having a Psychedelic Science 2025 conference in Denver from June 16th to the 20th. And we've had over 1,500 applicants for about 400 talks. So it'll be one of the world's largest conferences on psychedelics ever. We had Psychedelic Science 2023 in Denver. We had 12,400 people. So if people want to come and learn about the whole field, both business opportunities, nonprofit opportunities, this would be the place because you'll have the widest range. The other thing, Mo, gets back to what you said more about creativity in a sense. So we were fiscal sponsors. MAPS was fiscal sponsor for people that wanted to help the Yawanawa tribe. And it was created by a fellow named Hartmut Nevin. Now, Hartmut Nevin works for Google as far as their quantum computing team. He's one of the leading quantum computing experts in the world. And he was also deeply involved with ayahuasca with the Yawanawa. And he felt that there was ways in which thinking about quantum computing, which is mind-boggling somehow, that the ayahuasca experiences helped him both emotionally and intellectually. And so we have some of the most brilliant people on the planet at the cutting edge of science that are finding ayahuasca and other psychedelics valuable. So Sylvia, I'm really glad you mentioned the Yawanawa.
Yeah.
It's just amazing what we have the potential if we incorporate these kind of psychedelic states of mind into all aspects of life, into creativity, into helping people as they grow, into future bar mitzvahs for people.
Yeah. Other than revolutionizing bar mitzvahs, as I could only imagine you doing.
It's a remembering of an ancient technology that has not just spiritual use, but also has really life applications for how we do business and how we work and how we live.
Absolutely. And just maybe we'll end with this, Rick. I just want to point out, you've mentioned it, you've alluded to it, but you have given your life to this mission, to this cause, decades upon decades, fights that most people would not have endured, resilience beyond belief. And we commend your efforts, and we hope we could support your efforts going forward. But, number one, what do you hope your legacy will be at the end? And number two, for any parting advice that you would give to people that are still relatively new to this as to how they could explore how this could be additive to their communities and their families.
Okay. Well, I think as far as legacy, I would really like to, and I think it's already done. I realize that I would like to see that I've helped in one link in the chain. I got it from Stan Groff. Stan Groff, learned from others that I sort of kept the flame alive of non-ordinary states of consciousness and how we really need to integrate them. William James, who was the founder of American psychology, talked about nitrous oxide, giving him a sense that there's other layers of consciousness beyond the veil and that no account of human psychology is complete without all these other layers of consciousness. That will sort of help bring back psychedelics from being super demonized, totally suppressed, and now kind of mainstreamed. That is really what I want for all different, and that we look at the drug war as a fundamental, counterproductive, super wasteful, punitive situation, and we change the drug policy as well. That would be the legacy that I would like to leave. And for people that are thinking about how and whether to integrate this into their lives or so, I would say that to approach this with a lot of respect. These substances they're just tools. They're not inherently beneficial. They're not inherently harmful, but they have enormous potential. So you could even talk about it in terms of the surgeon's knife, that it's either saves your life or it can be used to kill, that approach it with care and caution, but really think not so much about the drug experience, but about how you integrate it afterwards without the drug. That's the key thing to keep in mind. It's not just really what you go out, but it's what you bring back. And that there's a way in which you can access these states without drugs. That's the other thing. I think one of the main mistakes that was made of the disease is people thought if they've done LSD, they knew stuff that nobody else knew, and they were more advanced. I'm enlightened, and I've done this. But you can access these states without any drug at all, with hyperventilation, or fasting, or meditation. So I think while we've focused a lot on psychedelics, I want to make it clear that they are just one tool among many to get to these states of consciousness that are inherent in us, and that they don't come from the drug. When you have one of the things, Sasha Shulgin, who was really the one that helped bring back MDMA and invented hundreds of new psychedelics, he talked about his first experience with mescaline. That was his first psychedelic experience. And what he realized, that he felt this connection and all this beauty, but he realized that he wasn't having a mescaline experience. He was having a human experience that the mescaline helped him access.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
That is beautiful. Rick, cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to join us and just shower us with the wisdom and insights that you have. And I really hope that you continue for many, many years to come. You're doing God's work, and we all appreciate it.
Yeah, I will just add that I had this dream in my 20s with a Holocaust survivor telling me to study psychedelics and bring it back.
Oh.
And that was really what has kept me motivated this whole time. It was the most powerful dream of my whole life. And it was this sense that we can dehumanize others. But if you feel this interconnection, that was what this Holocaust survivor was telling me, is that he actually said in the dream that I was miraculously survived. I didn't get killed. I survived, and I knew I had a purpose, and I didn't know what the purpose was. And in the dream, he's on his deathbed, and he's talking to me, and he said, now I know what my purpose is. And he says, tell you to study psychedelics. And I realized in my own head, I said, I have already decided to do that. I can take this on and you can die in peace. And then he died in front of my eyes in the dream.
Wow. I mean, that's a soul contract if I ever heard one.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Rick,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for helping share the word and share it.
We really appreciate it.